suitable and correct translations are made into different languages, especially from the original texts of the sacred books. That's the wish of the Council Fathers. Suitable and correct translations. But that's not that easy as it is written here. What is a correct translation? In the line of the Constitution, we can see that different institutions within the church and also popes in several documents are implicitly or explicitly making reference to the Verbum 22. For example, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and Benedictus is part of that commission. That document was written before she was member of the commission. Fundamentalism often show a tendency to ignore or to deny the problems presented by the biblical text in its original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek form. It is often narrowly bound to one fixed translation. So that makes also clear that we have to look for maybe different translations. One translation often is not enough. Or Pope Benedict XVI, in the post-synodal apostolic exhortation Verbum Domini, emphasized the statements of the Synod Fathers about the ecumenical importance of translations of the Bible in the various languages. We know, I quote, that translating a text is no mere mechanical task, but belongs in some sense to the work of interpretation, theological interpretation. In this regard, Pope John Paul II observed that anyone who recalls how heavily debates about Scripture influence divisions, especially in the West, can appreciate a significant step forward which these common translations represent. So promoting common translations of the Bible is part of the ecumenical enterprise. And the Pope continues, I would like to thank all those engaged in this important work, and I encourage them to persevere in their efforts. So translating the Bible is one of the concerns of the Vatican Council. And very recently, some months ago, in his address to the Catholic Biblical Federation, Pope Leo said, ensuring easy access, once more that expression, easy access from the Verbum, to sacred scripture for all the faithful is essential, so that everyone may encounter the God who speaks, shares his love, and draws us into the fullness of life. In this regard, translations of the scriptures remain indispensable. So in line of this wish of the Council Fathers, translating the Bible is and must remain something very important. But it's rather complicated. Benedict already said the text is not written in Malayalam, nor in English, nor in German, or in Greek, or in English, but for the Old Testament in Hebrew and then the New Testament in Greek, but not living Greek, but Greek as a dead language. So we have to transpose these dead languages into modern languages. And that's not easy. And I would like to show you that on the basis of one single verse, even more, one single word. One single word that is difficult to translate. Nevertheless, an easy word, an easy verb, which can be found in Deuteronomy 34, verse 6. Probably you know the text. It's the text that deals, that's the last chapter of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, the fifth book of the Old Testament, that deals with the death of Moses and the burial of Moses. But behind this text, that seems at first sight rather easy, there is a huge theological discussion. So we are dealing in translating the text with theological matters. Let's have a look to Deuteronomy 34 as such. Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo. And the Lord showed him all the land. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I sware unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the King James Version I quote here. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Some chapters earlier, God has said, You will die. And so this seems to be the fulfillment of what God announced to Moses. So Moses is dying according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley of Moab. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. This seems to be a rather easy text. Nevertheless, let's have a look to some different translations. And so the Council Fathers say we shall translate the biblical text. In particular, verse 6 of this chapter. The verse that deals with the burial of Moses. I have here the text in Hebrew. It's not that important, but I also have some 8 or 7 translations of this verse. Moses dies according to the word of the Lord. And then, the NIRV says, the Lord buried the body of Moses. As the second one, and the Lord buried him in a valley. That's the first category of translations. The New Living Version, Moses dies as the word of the Lord said, and he buried him in the valley. So not the Lord. The Lord is not explicitated. He buried him, but we know that the translator is thinking about the Lord because he is written as a capital. He, the Lord. As also ChatGPT is doing. I asked ChatGPT, make a translation of this verse. Now, ChatGPT is not inventing things. ChatGPT is making use of other translations, of course. And so the result of ChatGPT is he, with a capital, buried him in the valley. So the Lord, or he, or the King James Version, and he buried him in a valley, but he without capital. Now, in general, the King James Version is not using a capital when talking about God. It's also used when talking about human beings. So here, actually, we cannot know who is that he. Is it God or is it a human being? And when we have a look to the 2 last ones, we see that another solution is given. He buried him, or between brackets, he was buried, and that's something different. That's a passive form. As the new RSC, as the Lord's command, he died and he was buried. So it seems that the translator of the 2 last translations is avoiding the element that God is burying Moses. Moses was buried. By whom? It's not clear in the translation. I don't know whether you know a little or a bit more Hebrew, but let's have a look to the Hebrew text because the Vatican Council was saying we have to look to the original text. So that's what we're going to do, having a look to the original text. And the original text is quite easy. A verb in the 3rd person is used. But as you know, in ancient Hebrew, no vowels are used, only consonants. And the Masoretes in medieval times, they added some vowels. But adding vowels is interpreting already the text. So the unvocalized Hebrew, we cannot pronounce it because we need vowels. It's something like that. We can't pronounce it. The Masoretes, the Jewish people who interpreted, who vocalized the text, they vocalized that verbal form as a 3rd person singular. He buried. But it's not clear who. It's said that Moses dies according to the word of the Lord, and he buried, but it's not said that it's God himself. So the two first translations I showed you are adding something in the translation. The Lord buried the body, and the Lord buried, it's not in the text. It's added by the translator. That can be problematic. Another possibility to vocalize this form is to vocalize it as a passive form, what we call a nifal. So he was buried. Moses was buried. So that last category, he died as the Lord has said, and he was buried, has also its basis within the Hebrew text. It's also a possibility, in theory. But actually, it's not a possibility because in Hebrew we have something we don't have in English, we don't have in Dutch, I don't know in your language. There is that element oto. Oto, that's not a car, but that's an accusative. He buried him. So he was buried, him, that doesn't function in Hebrew. So it cannot be, on the basis of the language, it cannot be a passive form. It must be an active form. So he buried him. And then remains the question, who buried Moses? Was it God? Or was it human being? Because the text is not making it explicitly. Was it God who was burying Moses? But then, from a theological perspective, and here we come in contact with the theology, God is presented in a very anthropomorphic way. God is a gravedigger. That's a bit strange. God is touching a dead body. Is that possible from a theological perspective? In Judaism, it's quite difficult to accept that. We have different texts in the Old Testament, in the Bible, that say a dead body that's impure. And so how can God touch, almost like a human being, a dead body? And probably this element is the reason why some translators are avoiding God as burying Moses. So there is some theology behind this interpretation. Is it he? So who? Is it a man? Was it a human being who buried Moses? But then when we are reading the context of that chapter, it's quite strange because Moses is on the mountain and he alone is on the mountain together with God. So saying that a human being was burying Moses, but he was alone there. Was he later discovered his dead body? But then we are interpreting. So translating the Bible, as the Vatican Council asks, it seems to be easy, but it's not at all that easy. We can also translate, and no single translation, as far as I know, is doing it that way, on an impersonal matter. Not he buried him, but someone buried Moses. And that's possible from the Hebrew. As for example, the second book of Kings makes clear, somebody buried him, King Ammon, in his tomb. The same verb, vayikboch oto, someone, we don't know who, was burying Moses. So the text seems to be easy. A verb, to bury, third person singular, quite easy to interpret at first sight, but in the context of this biblical text, rather complicated. The documents of the council and of the several popes, they refer to the ancient translations. And it's also always useful to have a look to the ancient translations, how they did deal with that problem we have, how to translate a biblical text. So let's have a look to the ancient translations and the ancient versions of this verse. The most ancient version we have, and we discovered it quite recently, are the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the second half of the 20th century in Qumran, near to the Dead Sea. You heard about it, undoubtedly. And here we see something very interesting. That's not a translation, that's a Hebrew text that is unvocalized, so no vowels. But we can see that the third person singular we have in our Bibles, and Benedict was making reference to that manuscript of the 10th century Christian era, we can see that 10, 11, 12 centuries earlier, we have the same text, but with one letter in addition. Here it is not, and he buried him, but a plural form is used. They buried him. Vayikberu. And so the most ancient text of this passage in the Bible we have is not reading a singular person, but a plural. Immediately it's clear that God cannot be the subject of the verb. God can, according to this manuscript in Qumran, not be the one who buried Moses. And you can say, is it important to deal that in detail with all those elements? I think it is, because I don't know how it is in Syro-Malabar, right? But in Roman Catholic liturgy, this text is read during liturgy. So we are reading a text in translation, but actually translating this text is quite difficult. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have another interpretation of this text. What the reason of this variant reading is, it's quite difficult to discover. So they buried him in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who are those they? Also, a plural form in Hebrew can be used to indicate an impersonal form. So it can also be someone. So Hebrew can use a singular form or a plural form just to say someone buried. So not necessarily they, plural people. So interpreting already these Hebrew form is quite difficult. As we can see, for example, in the book of Joshua, after these things, Joshua, the servant of the Lord, died, and they buried him in his own inheritance. Someone buried him. Plural form or singular form. One of the documents I quoted already made reference to the Septuagint, the most ancient translation. And what can we see here? That all manuscripts we have of the Septuagint, all manuscripts, read a third person plural. No single one has a third person singular. So they buried Moses in the land of Moab. And what in general is said is that all those versions, all those texts who read a third person plural are reacting against an anthropomorphic presentation of God. We cannot accept that God is presented as a human being, as a gravedigger, as someone who is touching a dead body and who is digging a grave and putting that dead body in the grave. That's what they say. If it's true, that's something else. Anyway, before the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was generally accepted that people said the Septuagint translator, the Greek translator, he changed the Hebrew text. Thanks to the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we also read that third person plural, it is probable that the Septuagint translator was translating a Hebrew text that also was reading a third person plural. So he was not changing the text he was translating. What are the theological implications of all these elements? Which is now the best text? How to translate this text? He buried him, the Lord buried him, but then you're adding something to a text, and I don't like it, adding elements to the biblical text. One moment. Which was the most original version of these things? Was it singular? Was it plural? We can see within the history of interpretation different perspectives. For example, in order to indicate that Moses was the greatest prophet, God himself had to bury him. There is no one similar to Moses. So Moses, in order to indicate that he was that important, the author or copyist was accentuating that God has buried Moses himself. So it is not impossible that the original text was reading, they buried him. But in order to make clear that it was not just a human being who was burying Moses, they changed the text and they said, no, it was God himself who did it. And so the statue of Moses became even more important. He's the only one in the whole Bible who is buried by God himself. Or, in tradition, reacting against the possible interpretation that God was presented as anthropomorphic, as too anthropomorphic, it was said that Moses was not buried by God, but for example by angels. And so the plural form, they, the angels, buried Moses. Or, and that's very strange in Jewish tradition, that Moses even buried himself. Reacting once more against this anthropomorphic presentation of the text. What was the original text? What is the best text? How to translate this text? It's not easy to find out. Moreover, it's a quite mysterious text, and probably the text is made deliberately that mysterious to form an inclusion with the beginning of the book of Exodus, where Moses is saved in a mysterious way. So saved, his birth was almost mysterious, he survived, he was not killed by Pharaoh, and so his death and his burial was maybe also presented by the authors of the text as something mysterious. Maybe the authors of the text, they deliberately made a text that is not clear, just to indicate the special status of Moses. But for us, who have to translate these biblical texts, Deu Verbum, make the text easy accessible, all those things make us life not easy. How to translate the Bible? Can we translate the Bible in an exact way? Or should we, in those cases, put some footnotes? There are different possibilities. And this is what was said also in reaction against fundamentalism. One single translation can be dangerous because the text is so rich, and that's also a theological implication. The biblical text is so rich that sometimes it's impossible to fix on one single translation. So I think what the Vatican Council was accentuating, and we have to accept that, the Protestant tradition was already doing long before Catholic tradition, we have to take care of that. Translating the Bible, making it accessible. And I can only encourage you to study the Hebrew languages, to study the different translations. And even when you don't know the Hebrew and the Greek, at least try to have a look to several translations in order to find out the richness of our biblical tradition. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, I'm pretty sure that the exposition of Professor Hans was very interesting, wonderful, and enlightening. Let us give him a big applause. I never thought that burying Moses was this complicated, Professor. So now it is time for questions.
I just want to ask you one thing. There were different copies available at the Dead Sea Scrolls when it was found in 1947, no? Different copies. Were all the copies keeping the same third person plural?
there are different copies, but of this text there is only one copy.
Okay.
So of this text there is only one copy in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have to correct myself later. One copy, and that's reading a third person plural. Also, a copy has been discovered in Masada. Maybe you heard about Masada.
Yeah.
One copy of this text was also discovered. There is only one problem with this text. I don't know whether I have it. Maybe I have it, I can show it. In general, and that's also showing how biblical texts are used sometimes as propaganda. You know, for the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew text, the so-called Masoretic text, is the most important one. Now they are saying that the manuscript that was found in Masada already showed that there was a third person singular reading. So that is a text where there is a third person singular reading. Maybe I have it here. I can try to show you. I don't know whether I have it. No, it's hidden. But when you have a look to the manuscript itself, so we don't have access to the manuscripts themselves, but they are on the internet and in very good scans, you cannot decide whether there was that last letter or not, because the manuscript is cut off at that moment. So maybe in the manuscript in Masada, it was a third person plural. Maybe it was a third person singular. We cannot use that manuscript. It's useless. So there are two manuscripts. One is a third person and the other one is useless.
May I ask you one thing more?
Yeah, of course.
The Qumran scrolls found in 1947 to 1956, the period. And the Septuagint was translated in 3rd BC or 2 BC. So what can be the source of the Septuagint translation to third person plural rather than the third person singular?
Well, we don't know. We don't know the manuscript or the text that was used by the Septuagint translators. Now, when we have a manuscript in Qumran dating, for example, from the 3rd century BC, it makes clear that at that moment there was a tradition that read a third person plural. Whether it was this manuscript that has been used as a source for the translation, we don't know. But it makes clear, at least, that the tradition of reading existed. And we have to be careful. It's not because of the manuscript dates from the 3rd century BC that the text, the content of the text, also dates from the 3rd century. It can be much older. So the material texts don't say anything about the content of the text that can be much older than the text. So it makes clear, it was before Qumran, it was always said when there is a different reading in the Greek text, it was the responsibility of the Septuagint translator. That was the automatic answer that was given. Now we know that there already existed a Hebrew tradition that often follows, that is identical with the Greek text. And that's so we don't have to blame too easily the Septuagint for what have been called mistakes. Probably he was not making a mistake, he was not changing, he was not adapting the text, he was just following another manuscript tradition that we didn't know before 1947. But that's very complicated. That's what we call textual criticism. The analysis of the history of the text.
How it is kept in the Peshitta translation, the Syriac?
I'm not sure. I know in the Samaritan Pentateuch, there are both elements. Singular manuscript and plural. I can check for you.
Diverbum 22 emphasizes about translations of the Bible with the intention of easy access to sacred scripture to all people. Though 60 years there are many people and places who could not access easily Bible. What can we do for this?
translating, first of all, translating the Bible. It's the best translated book, I think, in the world. And so there are many societies, Bible societies, who are trying to translate and to promote the Bible. But we have to be aware that it's a difficult process. And that's the reason also people often ask, which is the best Bible translation? The best Bible translation has not yet been made. We have to wait. We have to continue working on these texts. And therefore it's that important that we continue just to translate the Bible. So what can we do? Find a lot of money, often, to do it, and to continue studying the Bible and analyzing these texts. I think it's important. And if the translations are not available, there are many translations, and just use them and compare them.
Thank you. One more question.
Yes.
In this digital era, most of us are happy to read digital text of the Bible. Then, what is the relevance of written Bible, means hard copy?
I would say they are complementary. They are complementary. It's when I have a look at our context in Belgium and the students we have, when I'm teaching, almost never I see a student having its Bible, a hard copy. They have them on screen. And that's also a possibility because you have immediately different Bibles at hand. Otherwise, you have to take different translations and different editions. So I think it's complementary.
Thank you very much for your scholarly exposition. This text is very much important for me as a member of the Malangara Catholic Church. In the funeral rites of our priest, actually, this passage is mentioned at least 5 times or more. The idea behind is God the Father and the community of angels were present there. That is actually they are repeated again and again in all hymns. Not only the funeral or the burial of Moses is complicated, death also. Both Aaron and Moses, they were both healthy. The date of their death is fixed. They were summoned and the water was actually produced from the rock. And they did not reveal the holiness of Yahweh. Therefore, it is as a punishment. Yesterday you mentioned about the retribution. I think, is it a punishment or a reward? Why I am saying it? Because then I think I am not a Bible scholar. If my memory is correct, Deuteronomy 10:9, there is a mentioning that you belong to all the Levites. In our tradition, we call priest Moses and Aaron are the first priests. So you belong to. They have no share in the promised land. I am your asset. I am your asset. I am your inheritance. So God do not allow them to go to the promised land. Joshua took them. So it can be taken as a punishment or it can be taken as a reward. You belong to me. I am your asset. I am your inheritance. So the whole text actually revealing, in my opinion, I am not a biblical scholar, that showing the intimacy of the relationship between God and these high priests. So in that sense, who buried, how buried, that is not important. And I heard that there is a Jewish text saying that the life is merged with the life of Yahweh. So my question is, which is important? The literal important, going down to the nuances of the linguistic issues, or the message?
I should say, but I talking here as a biblical scholar, the message to the meaning of the text. The first thing we are doing as biblical scholars is try to find out what the text is saying, and then interpreting it, and trying to find out what can the theological meaning, not just impose a theological meaning on a text without understanding the text.
Do you find that sometimes the text become incapable of communicating the message.
I'm sorry?
The language became incapable of communicating the message. As you said, God is presented as an anthropomorphic way is not fitting. So they take a mysterious way of communicating the message.
But that's what I was telling was it's just one hypothesis, because elsewhere we can see that many texts in the Bible, God is presented in an anthropomorphic way. It's talked about his nose, his ears, his arms, his hand. So apparently the translators at that level didn't have a problem with presenting God in an anthropomorphic way. It's also learning us a lot, this way of analyzing the text, of how theology, who is Exodus 15, God is presented as a man of war, literally. When we have a look to the Septuagint, God is the one who is smattering wars. So he's reacting against war. So translations and versions of text give us also an access to how theology is not something, theology on a biblical level is not something that is fixed and once and forever, but also, as Benedict said, there is an interpretation within the Bible and sometimes an evolution. Even have we to be careful with imposing evolutions to the Bible, because it's possible that some ideas are contemporary and that some author think it's that way and another says, I think it's another way. So it's also possible within biblical literature, and that's precisely the richness of the Bible as a collection of books. It's not one single book, it's a collection of books that came into being through the time in a diachronic process by different authors, I think.
Thank you.
Professor, first of all, I thank you for your thought-provoking session. You have said that one single translation is rigid or impossible, and it is important position against fundamentalism. So, if we hold that position, will it lead to relativism, or each one hold each position? Will it lead to a relativism?
I did. What was your?
You have said.
Oh well, no, not at all. It's just trying. All those different translations are just trying to because of the complexity of the text. It's not relativism, because who can say which is the real and the only and the correct translation? And relativism, that would say, yeah, you can do what you want, but here there are arguments for the different possibilities. It's not because I think or I like that one. No, there are really arguments for saying, and sometimes it's impossible to say to come to one definite argument. So I think it's not at all relativism, not at all. It's just to be honest with regard to the complexity of the biblical text.
I'm sure that there will be many more questions because the exposition was that interesting and it has enkindled our interest to study Bible, I hope. It's very interesting. And we are used with mechanical translations like Google translators and all. And he has explained that translating Bible is not something mechanical or technical. It is much more a theological act where each translator is trying to teach us something, and in that way he's trying to form the faith of the people. Thank you very much, Professor Hans, once again, in the name of all of us. now it is time for the lunch, and we will begin our next session at 1:15.
1:15 we will start, 15 minutes in advancing the session. Next session, ഫസ്റ്റ് ഇയേഴ്സും സെക്കൻഡ് ഇയേഴ്സും അവർ അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്യുന്ന ക്ലാസ്, അതായത് അവർ എല്ലാ ക്ലാസ്സും അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. നാളത്തെ ഡിസ്കഷൻ വേണ്ട, അതുപോലെ ഇനാഗുറൽ സെഷൻ, അത് ഇനാഗുറൽ ഇതൊന്നും വേണ്ട. അവർ ജസ്റ്റ് ഒന്ന് ചുമ്മാ കുറിക്കുക, നോട്ട് കുറിക്കുക, അത്രേ വേണ്ടൂ. വേറെ പേപ്പറായിട്ട് കൊടുക്കണ്ട, നിങ്ങൾ ഉറങ്ങാതിരിക്കാനും വേണ്ടി കൂടിയിട്ട്. Yeah, so keep the notes and then submit to me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Subi Cherudotil, for moderating the session. It's now time for lunch. Lunch has been arranged as follows. All other dignitaries and the staff of